Dawn rises over Kerak in 1190 BC. Imagine standing where modern tourists now gather, camera in hand, gazing up at the massive columns that stretch into the sky like stone prayers. The scene is majestic, grand, civilized, the work of gods. But hidden beneath your feet in the temple's deepest chamber, archaeologists uncovered something in 1923 that made them stop digging for 3 days. A fragment of limestone, intentionally concealed, faintly scratched with something barely visible in the dim light. Child-sized handprints, dozens of them pressed into wet plaster along a corridor that lead to nowhere. Tiny fingers pushing with desperate force, and beside them, crudely carved in hieratic script, the everyday writing of common people. One message repeated 17 times: Mut does not hear us. Mut, the mother goddess, protector of children, guardian of innocence. Why would children devoted to her, to the very goddess herself, carve a message saying that she can't hear them? What were they trying to tell us after 3,000 years? Official records call these girls blessed. Stone inscriptions, polished smooth and painted in gold, called them pure ones, divine brides, and chosen of the gods. Beautiful words. But sometimes, the most beautiful words hide the ugliest truths. In 1923, British archaeologist Margaret Murray was cataloguing pottery shards and measuring foundation stones in the basement archives of the Temple of Mut in Luxor. It was routine work. Then she found a sealed clay jar, plain and undecorated, deliberately hidden behind a false wall in a storage room that had remained undisturbed for over 2,000 years. Inside there were 17 papyrus letters. She tried to show her findings to the Egyptian Antiquities Service, but they confiscated the jar, declaring the contents classified. 3 senior Egyptologists, respected men who had spent their lives translating temple texts, refused to even touch it. One of them wrote in his diary, "Some truths are better left buried." The jar and its contents were sealed away for 71 years. What was in those letters? And why did those who read them wish they hadn't? If you're someone who believes that documented history is more important than comforting myths, you're in the right place. Every subscription to Crimson Historians helps us gain access to archives, translate original sources, and bring forgotten voices back into the light. Hit that subscribe button, and let's take a deeper dive, because what comes next is even darker than you think. Let's go back to Egypt, during the New Kingdom period, from 1550 to 1077 BC. This was the height of Egypt's power, the Golden Age. You've seen the movies, the glory, the divine right of kings. But here's what museums often leave out. Egyptian temples weren't just places of worship. They were massive corporations. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, for example, controlled 81,000 workers, owned 421,000 cattle, managed 83 ships, and held more land than even the pharaoh himself. These details come from the Wilbiar Papyrus, which is currently housed in the Brooklyn Museum. You can go see it yourself and read the meticulous accounting done by ancient Egyptians, where they listed properties just like inventory. The priests were not just holy men, they were more like landlords, using the gods' names to manage vast empires of land and wealth. Here's how the system worked. A farmer could take a loan from the temple, receiving copper for tools and grain for planting. The priest would smile and say, "The gods provide." But the interest would always compound, benefiting the temple. The farmer's first harvest wouldn't be enough to repay the loan. The second harvest wouldn't cover it either. By the third year, the debt had tripled, and the priests would come for their payment. The farmer had 3 choices: lose his land, enter into debt slavery for his entire family, or dedicate his daughter to the temple. The priests said more flattering words for it. "She will live in the house of the divine," they'd say. "She will be blessed beyond measure." But the truth was that the girl would become an unpaid servant for life. In the workers' village of Durrell-Medina, archaeologists found contracts, legal documents signed by fathers, giving away their daughters to the temple. One contract reads, in the 3rd year of Ramses IX, the farmer Ammon, he, unable to repay 15 amen of copper, gives his daughter Nefertiti to the house of Ammon for perpetual service. Nefertiti was only 9 years old. The contract listed her age, her village, and the debt amount, everything accounted for in legal witness terms. Her father traded her for the equivalent of about 3 months' wages. But here's the twist. These girls weren't doing simple, menial labor. Many of them were taught to read and write, skills that 90% of Egyptians would never learn. Some even became God's wives of Ammon. They managed temple accounts, commanded servants, wore gold, and lived in luxury, power, education, and wealth, yet they still had no freedom. So why were there handprints on hidden corridors? Why was the phrase "Mut does not he rust" carved 17 times? Why did Margaret Murray's jar contain letters describing things the priests never documented? Something doesn't add up. The answer lies in what the priests called purification. If the thought of a 9-year-old being signed away like property doesn't make you want to remember her name, then history has already forgotten her. Don't let it. That's why we're here. In 1896, British archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated a priest's tomb. Inside, he found a papyrus scroll, a manual of instructions for temple initiation rites. This document, now held at the British Museum Catalogue Number A1042, is essentially an instruction manual for how to assemble a priestess, though it's not as innocent as assembling furniture. The text reads, on the day of her entering, the girl shall be bathed in the sacred pool. Her garments shall be removed in the presence of the priests. She shall be examined for purity of body. That word examined is chilling. The text continues, her hair shall be removed so no impurity remains. She shall speak the oath before Ammon. My body is the property of the god. My will is his will. The girl would be 8, 10, or 12 years old, standing naked in front of adult men, repeating words she couldn't understand, legally binding herself to a life she never chose. But here's where it gets even more strange. After initiation, these girls gained access to restricted areas of the temple, places even nobles couldn't enter. They handled sacred ritual objects, studied astronomy, mathematics, music. One inscription from Khan lists a woman named Nefertiti as the chief of the harem of Ammon, who managed temple accounts and commanded 300 servants. They had power but no freedom. They could manage the temple's treasuries but could never leave the temple grounds. They could read hieroglyphs but couldn't write to their families. They could command servants but couldn't say no to priests. In the 1960s, Danish archaeologist Lise Amanica studied pottery shards from the Temple of Oestrakan, used by ancient Egyptians as notepads. Among them, she found medical prescriptions, dozens of them, many for young women in temples. These prescriptions were for genital trauma, remedies to prevent forced conception, and instructions for midwives aiding girls as young as 11 through childbirth. One piece of pottery reads, for the girl who bleeds after the god's visitation, grind acacia leaves with honey. Apply to the wound, bind with clean linen. The god's visitation. That's what they called it. Among the prescriptions, Manica found a letter written on a shard of pottery, the handwriting shaky as if the writer was trembling. It read, to my sister Mutinia, who serves in Mut's house. I am sorry I gave you to them. I am sorry I believed the priest when he said you would be blessed. Your mother weeps every night. I do not sleep. Forgive me. It's unsigned. The daughter never replied. Temple servants couldn't send letters. But before you think this was just universal horror, it was that simple. Some women in the temples wielded genuine political power. Take Hatshepsut, for example, the woman who became pharaoh and ruled Egypt for 20 years. She started as a god's wife of Ammon. Other women entered the temples voluntarily as adults, seeking education unavailable anywhere else and safety from forced marriages. So, what made the difference? What separated the powerful priestesses from the girls carving desperate messages in hidden corridors? The answer is in one word that the official records almost never mention: age. The letters in Margaret Murray's sealed jar, those 17 letters written by a woman named Templeabuse, who served in the temple of Mut for 40 years, explain a lot. Templeabuse describes something that the priests did every month. She called it the monthly choosing. The official temple records, carved into stone and painted in gold, never mention what that meant, but Templeabuse wrote it down, and what she wrote stayed buried in that jar for 3,000 years. Murray's personal notes are archived at University College London, and you can request them, fill out a form, and wait weeks to get a glimpse of them. In her diary from the 1923 excavation season, March 12th entry reads: found sealed jar today in false wall of southern storage chamber. Clay undecorated, deliberately hidden. Opened it in the field tent. Papers inside. Letters. I've read 3 so far. I wish I hadn't. On March 15th, she showed the translations to 2 colleagues, Harrison and Blackman. Both refused to continue. Harrison wrote in his diary, some truths are better left buried. As if that matters, as if money means more than truth. The Egyptian Antiquities Service confiscated the jar and classified its contents. They declared the letters were likely forgeries, despite being written in late New Kingdom Demotic script. The letters remained locked away for 71 years. Finally, in 1994, they were released to the public. But even now, most Egyptologists still haven't read them. These letters, written in Demotic, were the informal cursive used for personal correspondence, not the formal hieroglyphs of monuments. The handwriting was that of someone writing for themselves, writing the truth. Templeabuse's account reads, "In my 12th year of service, I was chosen for the monthly rite. I had seen other girls chosen before me. They always returned silent, changed. They took us to the inner sanctum after the evening offerings. 5 of us that month. The youngest was 8 years old. She cried. The overseer struck her and said tears were impurity. The high priest wore the mask of Ammon with ram's horns. He said the God would speak through him, that we were blessed to receive the divine seed, that our bodies were vessels for the God's pleasure. He said this was holy." Margaret Murray wrote in her notes, the account described systematic abuse disguised as religious duty, organized, scheduled, recorded in administrative logs like grain inventory. That's the terrifying brilliance of it. It was chaos. It was organized. Temple records for Medinet Habu show rotation schedules. Girls were listed by name with marks indicating their service dates. The youngest recorded was 7 years old. Not a mistake, not an anomaly, a policy. Templeabuse was the only one writing. The jar contained other letters. Other women had found it, this hidden vessel in a forgotten storage room, and added their own testimonies. One wrote my name was Marot, before they changed it to me. My father owed grain. The priest told him I would marry the god. He thought it meant honor. I was 11th. There is no God here. Only men in masks who say they speak for gods. Another wrote, I have served for 16 years. I have borne 3 children to the god. They took each one from me after 3 years. My eldest daughter now serves as I do. I see her in the morning processions. She does not look at me. I think they told her I am dead. On March 15th, 1923, Margaret Murray wrote in her diary, I have read things today that make me question whether I should continue in Egyptology. These were children. This was systematic, recorded, managed. And we have been calling these temples sacred for 200 years of scholarship. Remember those handprints, the ones pressed into wet plaster in the dead-N corridor beneath the temple of Mut? Tentipet's letters explain them. When the girls were first brought to the temple for initiation, they were led through that narrow, dark passage. The priest told them, "Press your hands here against the wall. You are reborn beyond this threshold. Your old self dies here." So, the girls pressed their hands into the wet plaster, children, confused and scared, doing what they were told. But years later, when some of these girls tried to escape, yes, they did try. Tentipet writes about 3 attempts they would return to that corridor. It was the only part of the temple without guard patrols, and they would press their hands again. The same wall, the same place, but now their hands were older, larger, pressing harder, and beside their handprints they carved something. A message Mut does not hear us. This was to prayer. It was a witness statement, a message to whoever might find it. We were real. We existed. This happened to us. But here's the darkest part. The priests documented everything. They kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and services rendered. They wrote about the girls' purity and devotion with the same bureaucratic efficiency they used for counting grain stores. One administrative text from Karnak reads, Year 7, 3rd month of inundation. Day 12. 5 new servants of Ammon received the god's blessing in the inner sanctuary. The god was pleased. 5 new servants, ages not mentioned. The god was pleased. They wrote it down, and not out of guilt, but out of religious duty. They genuinely believed they were serving the gods. If you've made it this far, you're carrying this truth now, just as Margaret Murray did in 1923, just as those girls did 3,000 years ago. You can close this video and forget everything you've seen, or you can subscribe to Crimson Historians and help us ensure that these voices, the ones they tried to seal in jars and bury in archives, never get silenced again. The choice is yours. Make it count. By the late New Kingdom, around 1100 BC, something shifted. The position of God's wife of Ammon, once held by temple women from all backgrounds, became exclusively the domain of royal women, pharaohs' daughters, and princesses. These women were required to remain celibate. No marriage, no children, no divine unions. Why the change? The answer can be found in the Harris Papiers, one of the longest papyri ever discovered, now in the British Museum. Written by Ramses II around 1150 BC, it describes reforms to temple administration. Ramses used careful language, speaking of abuses that had corrupted the sacred houses and impurities that had stained the divine order. He didn't elaborate on the specifics, but he restructured everything, changed who could hold power, and adjusted who had access to whom. Egyptianrituals K. Robbins argues, this was a direct response to growing evidence of abuse complaints that had even reached the pharaoh's court. The solution? Put women from royal families, women with political power, education, and bodyguards into charge. These women couldn't be touched. They could say no. The irony is thick. The victims had become the solution. By 700 BC, the title of God's wife of Ammon essentially controlled Upper Egypt. She commanded armies, managed treasuries, and held power rivaling the pharaohs. She remained celibate, unmarried, and untouchable, a position of genuine authority, born from centuries of abuse. But the lower-ranking temple girls, their situations improved only marginally. The reforms protected the women at the top, but for everyone else, the system remained unchanged. Here's what's rarely discussed. Some of the most significant reforms came from a woman who had lived through the system herself. She penned WEP. I served as God's wife of Ammon from 700 to 650 BC. She was dedicated to the temple at age 9, lived there for 68 years, and when she gained power, she issued a decree carved into the walls at Karnak, still visible today, on the north side of the sacred lake. Her decree reads, "Let no girl enter service before her 15th year. Let no priest claim authority over her person or ritual duties. Let her family visit her 3 times yearly. Let her voice be heard in disputes." She had been 9 years old when they brought her to the temple. She remembered, and she used her power to change the system imperfectly and completely, but genuinely, the system that had hurt her. After 600 BC, something strange began to happen in the archaeological record. We find fewer and fewer personal accounts from temple servants. No more hidden letters, no more carved messages, no more pottery-shod confessions. Did the abuse stop? Or did record minus keeping simply become more centralized, more controlled? Did women stop writing their truths? Or did someone make sure those truths would never be found? Margaret Murray's sealed jar remained classified for 71 years. When it was finally released in 1994, most Egyptologists ignored it. It was too uncomfortable, too complicated. It was easier to write papers about theology and architecture, to marvel at the columns of the temples, than to face what was really happening behind those walls. Stand today in the hyper-style hall at Kerner. You could buy a plane ticket, walk through the same corridors where those girls walked, and look up at the 134 columns stretching toward the heavens. Each one is carved with prayers and hymns to the gods' stone fingers pointing toward eternity. Beautiful, isn't it? Now remember, every stone was laid by hands that had no choice. Every prayer was sung by voices that couldn't say no. Every offering was made by people who were themselves offerings. We build monuments and forget the bones beneath them. We see glory and ignore the cost. We call things sacred because it's easier than calling them what they really are. Margaret Murray wrote in her unpublished diary on March 18, 1923, "Civilization is not measured by the height of its monuments, but by the depth of its compassion for those who had no choice but to build them. By that measure we have learned nothing." How many systems today hide behind beautiful words? How many institutions claim divine authority while protecting the powerful? How many times have you heard this is tradition used to justify cruelty? The temples of Egypt are gone. The priests are dust. But the pattern is immortal. You've just witnessed one of history's darkest truths, not because it was uniquely evil, but because it was so normal, so organized, so accepted. It was thoroughly documented by people who truly believed they were doing holy work. If stories like this remind you of how fragile humanity is, how easily we mistake cruelty for tradition, abuse for honor, silence for consent, then subscribe to Crimson Historians. Because the only thing more dangerous than forgetting the past is refusing to see its reflection in the present. One last thing, remember Temple's letters. The 17 found in Margaret Murray's jar? The jar could hold 20. 3 letters are still missing. In 2003, an antiquities dealer in Cairo claimed to have found them. He said they had been in a private collection since the 1920s and that he knew where they were. He died of a heart attack 3 days later before he could reveal the location. Those 3 letters, according to Temple's index, which Murray translated before the Antiquities Service took the jar, contain names, specific names of priests, families who knew what was happening and stayed silent, officials who were paid to look away. Somewhere in Egypt, hidden in a private collection or buried beneath the sand, those names are waiting, and someone doesn't want them found. The stones remember, even when we'd rather forget. As the centuries passed, the voices of the temple girls faded into the shadows of history. But the whispers of their suffering linger, carried by the walls they touched in the records that never made it to the public eye. We can stand in the ruins of Karnak today, admire the grand columns, and marvel at the artistry and devotion they represent. But we must also remember the cost behind those monumental achievements. The priests of Ammon, those men who believed they were serving the gods, were not just sacred men. They were power brokers, rulers of an empire built on the backs of the vulnerable. The temple, with all its glory, was also a place where the powerless were sacrificed for the sake of maintaining the divine order. The girls who entered those sacred halls did not have the luxury of choice. They were part of a system that viewed them as tools, as objects of divine duty to be used, manipulated, and cast aside. Yet, there is hope to be found in the ashes of this painful history. The reforms put in place by women like Nwepii, who had been a victim of the system herself, paved the way for the eventual rise of women in powerful positions. These reforms didn't undo the harm done, but they offered a glimmer of change, a shift in the system that had long held women in bondage. The story of Egypt is not just one of oppression, but also one of resistance, survival, and the slow, painful journey toward empowerment. In the end, the temples that stood as symbols of divine might were also symbols of human vulnerability. They were places of worship, yes, but also places of exploitation. We cannot let history be reduced to a series of grand monuments and hollow glory. We must look deeper, past the layers of paint and stone, and ask who built these structures, who suffered, and who benefited. As we reflect on these dark chapters of history, it's important to understand that the cycle of exploitation was not unique to ancient Egypt. It echoes through time, appearing in different forms across different cultures, continuing to affect those without power, those whose voices go unheard. The Temple of Ammon, its columns reaching toward the heavens, symbolizes not just the divine, but the human cost of those who were forced to maintain it. We can see the remnants of these patterns in our own time. Every towering achievement, every societal advancement, has a hidden story, a story that often gets buried beneath the weight of progress. Like the priests of Ammon, there are those today who believe they are serving a greater purpose, while others are paying the price for their ambitions. The victims of the past were not just forgotten, they were erased from the historical narrative, their suffering sanitized, their voices silenced by the very systems that they helped to build. But the ancient handprints carved into the walls beneath the Temple of Mutest, and as a testament to the truth that history cannot fully erase. Though their names may never be known, those girls left behind evidence of their existence. They carved their truth into the very stone that was meant to contain them. In doing so, they defied the system that sought to render them invisible. Their silent cry, "Mut does not hear us," remains a haunting reminder of the power of the human spirit, even in the face of the most brutal circumstances. We can choose to ignore their voices, to continue to build monuments to our own success while turning a blind eye to the injustices that persist. Or we can choose to listen. We can choose to remember the ones who have been lost to history, the ones who were silenced, the ones who never had a choice. History has a way of repeating itself, but it also offers us a chance to break the cycle. It is up to us to decide whether we will continue to look the other way, or whether we will take the lessons of the past to heart, using them to create a more just and compassionate future. Every step we take in that direction is an acknowledgement that we can build a world where no one's suffering is hidden, where no voice is left unheard, and where no one is ever again forced to become part of a system that sees them as nothing more than a tool. The ancient handprints on the walls of the Temple of Mut are not just echoes from the past, they are an enduring message, one that calls us to confront uncomfortable truths. These girls, whose names are lost to time, managed to leave behind something that transcended their pain. In a world where they had no agency, no voice, they pressed their hands into the wet plaster, leaving a mark for future generations. They carved into the stone a cry for justice that, in the end, would outlive the men who sought to silence them. Their message was just about their suffering, it was about resistance. Even in their most desperate moments, they found a way to speak back, to refuse to be forgotten. Perhaps in some ways, they understood that what is written in stone is harder to erase than what is written on paper. Their message of defiance against an unjust system was carved into the very fabric of the temple, a place that symbolized divine power, yet also concealed human suffering. It's easy to look at the towering columns of Karnak and feel awe, to marvel at the ancient craftsmanship, the grandeur of a civilization that shaped much of the world's early history. But what we must also ask is, at what cost did this grandeur come? Those columns, beautiful as they are, were built by the hands of the powerless. The stone walls that rise toward the sky bear the weight not only of divine prayer but also of the silent screams of children who were forced to serve in the temple. Every prayer carved into those stones, every hymn sung to Ammon, was paid for by the lives of those who had no choice in the matter. The story of the Temple of Ammon and the girls who served there is not just about ancient Egypt, it's a story that transcends time and place. It is a story that is woven into the fabric of every society, every empire, and every institution where the powerful use their authority to control the powerless. It's a story that warns us of the dangers of blind devotion to power, of systems that justify cruelty in the name of tradition or divine will. And it's a reminder that, no matter how far we think we've come, the cycle of abuse and exploitation is still with us. Today, we are still building monuments, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. We build them to honor our achievements, to commemorate our progress, to create something lasting. But we must ask ourselves, what are we leaving behind? Who is paying the price for our successes? Who is being silenced, hidden, or erased in the process? As we walk through the halls of history, we must remember those who built the foundations, not with stone, but with their labor, their pain, and their sacrifice. The ancient girls in the Temple of Mut left behind more than just handprints. They left us with a choice. We can either continue to ignore their story, letting their suffering fade into the past, or we can acknowledge their truth, carry it forward, and ensure that such exploitation never happens again. The choice is ours, and it's one we must make every day. In the quiet of the present, it's easy to forget the past. The towering monuments, the gleaming artifacts, the historical records, they often mask the blood, sweat, and tears that went into creating them. We live in a world that celebrates achievements, progress, and success, but we rarely pause to question who paid the price for these triumphs. The temples of ancient Egypt, with their magnificent columns and elaborate carvings, are no different. They stand as symbols of greatness, but beneath their grandeur lies a history of exploitation, of those whose lives were consumed by the very structures that now inspire all. These forgotten voices, the girls who served in the temples, the men and women whose sacrifices are erased from the official narrative, carry with them the uncomfortable truth that history is oft unwritten by the powerful. It's written by those who have the means to leave their mark on the world, while the powerless are left to toil in silence. The priests, the kings, and the rulers of ancient Egypt built their legacies not just on divine favor, but on the backs of those who had no choice but to comply with the demands of the system. But what if we start asking different questions? What if we look beyond the grandeur of the temples and the glory of the pharaohs and ask, what was the cost? Who was left behind in the shadows of history? Their stories untold, their pain ignored. Perhaps it is time to give voice to those who have been silenced for so long. The children who pressed their hands into the walls of the Temple of Mut are no longer here to tell their stories, but their cries for help etched into the stone. Their message is clear: we were here, we suffered, and we deserve to be remembered. Their suffering is not just an ancient relic, it is a reflection of the injustices that still plague our world today. The world may have moved on, but the systems of power that lead to their exploitation are not confined to the past. Today, we still see the exploitation of the vulnerable, the silencing of the oppressed, the erasure of voices that challenge the status quo. Just like the priests who claim divine authority to justify their actions, modern systems often use the language of tradition, duty, or even religion to hide the cruelty they perpetuate. But we must refuse to let these justifications stand. To honor the memory of those who came before us, we must confront the uncomfortable truths of their lives. We must hold up the stories of the powerless, not just as a lesson from the past, but as a call to action for the present and the future. We cannot continue to build monuments to our achievements while ignoring the cost of those who had no choice but to serve them. It's easy to forget, but it's not too late to remember. History is not just about the monuments we build, it's about the lives we shape, the systems we uphold, and the choices we make. The girls of the Temple of Mut may be gone, but their message still resonates. It's time we listen. The temptation to look away is strong. It's easier to admire the beauty of a monument without considering what it took to build it. It's simpler to romanticize the past, to admire the grandeur of ancient civilizations without acknowledging the suffering that underpinned their achievements. But this is the danger of history, the danger of accepting only the stories that are told by the powerful, by those who control the narrative. If we continue to turn a blind eye, if we continue to glorify the surface while ignoring the depths, we risk repeating the same mistakes. The girls of the Temple of Mut were not just victims, they were silent witnesses. Their handprints on the walls, their desperate carvings, were their attempt to make sure their suffering was not lost to time. They wanted us to know. They wanted to be remembered, not as nameless servants, but as real people with hopes, fears, and voices that mattered. Their message, written in desperation, was not just a cry for help, but a demand for recognition, a call for the world to stop and take notice of the lives that were being destroyed in the name of the divine. But in a world that values power, wealth, and success above all else, their voices were easily ignored. The priests, the rulers, and the wealthy elite who benefited from this system of exploitation had no incentive to listen. They had no reason to question the status quo when it served them so well. And so, for centuries, the truth remained buried, hidden beneath the grandeur of the temples, the gold of the pharaohs, and the stories of divine favor. Yet, the truth has a way of resurfacing. It doesn't matter how many walls are built to conceal it, how many records are destroyed, or how many voices are silenced. The truth finds a way out, just as the handprints on the walls of the Temple of Mut have endured for thousands of years. The messages carved into those walls are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the most oppressive of circumstances, the truth will always find a way to be heard. But truth alone is not enough. Recognition is not enough. Action is required. The past, with all its suffering and injustice, cannot be allowed to fade into history. It must serve as a lesson. We must confront the uncomfortable truths of our own time and ask ourselves, who is being silenced today? Who is paying the price for the monuments we build, the systems we uphold, and the power we protect? The girls of the Temple of Mut were not just ancient victims, they are a mirror for us to examine the systems we live under today. It's easy to dismiss these questions. It's easy to say that times have changed, that the world is different now, that we are more enlightened, more just. But are we? The handprints of those girls are a reminder that even in the most advanced civilizations, cruelty can thrive under the guise of holiness, duty, or tradition. The question is not whether we have changed, but whether we have learned. The monuments we build today, whether physical or ideological, are built on the same foundations of power, control, and exploitation that have existed for millennia. The systems of inequality that enabled the priests of Ammon to manipulate and oppress are still alive in our world today. The names have changed, the faces have changed, but the structures of power remain. The question is, will we continue to ignore the suffering beneath our feet? Or will we finally start to listen to the voices that have been silenced for so long? As we continue to explore these dark corners of history, we must ask ourselves a vital question: what will we do with the truths we uncover? It's one thing to acknowledge the suffering of those who came before us, it's another to take that knowledge and use it to shape a more just future. The handprints of those girls beneath the temple of Mut are not just relics of a distant past, they are a call to action. A reminder that history, if left unchecked, will continue to repeat itself. The systems of oppression that existed in ancient Egypt were not isolated, they were part of a larger human tendency to exploit the vulnerable in the name of power, religion, or tradition. These patterns can still be seen today in modern-day human trafficking, in the exploitation of children, in the disenfranchisement of entire communities. The faces may change, but the mechanisms of control are strikingly similar. Power continues to be wielded by those at the top, often in the name of a higher purpose, while those at the bottom are left to suffer in silence. The ancient Egyptians may have had their gods and their priests, but today, we have our institutions, our corporations, our governments. And while these systems may present themselves as protectors, as arbiters of justice, they too often shield the powerful from accountability, while the powerless are left to bear the weight. We build monuments to progress, to power, to success, but we must ask ourselves, what are we really honoring? Who is left behind in the shadows? Whose sacrifice is conveniently forgotten as we celebrate our own achievements? The truth is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. To truly honor the memory of those who came before us, whether they were ancient Egyptians or modern victims, we must be willing to confront the systems that perpetuate their suffering. We must be willing to ask the hard questions, to challenge the powers that be, and to ensure that the voices of the voiceless are never silenced again. This is not just about remembering the past. It's about changing the present. We cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the injustices that continue to unfold around us. Every time we look away, we become complicit in the perpetuation of systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many. But every time we choose to listen, to speak out, to take action, we take one step closer to breaking the cycle. The handprints in the Temple of Mut are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They are a message from the past, a plea for justice, a demand for recognition. But they are also a warning. If we fail to listen, we risk allowing the same injustices to continue, hidden in the shadows, invisible to those who choose not to look. We must do better. We must choose to listen, to remember, and to act. The legacy of those who suffered in silence should not be defined by their pain alone, but by the change they inspire in us. The walls of the temple may be silent now, but the handprints remain. And the message is clear: we were here. We existed. And our suffering will not be forgotten. The past is a mirror reflecting not only the mistakes of history, but also the opportunities to do better. The handprints beneath the Temple of Mut are not merely ancient artifacts, they are symbols of resistance. They tell us that even in the most oppressive systems, even when the chances of escape seem impossible, there's always a desire to be seen, to be heard. The suffering of these girls was not in vain, for their actions speak to us across time. They left behind more than just handprints, they left us with the responsibility to see the hidden stories of others in our own time. Today, as we stand in the shadow of ancient Egypt's temples, it's tempting to distance ourselves from the suffering that took place within them. After all, that was the past. We like to think that we've evolved, that we've learned from history, that we've built a society that values fairness and justice. But if we look closer, we might find that the same systems of exploitation are still alive today, just in different forms. Think about the modern-day systems that still perpetuate inequality. In the world's most powerful countries, children still face exploitation in the form of forced labor, trafficking, and neglect. While we live in an era of technological advancement and political progress, millions still live under the weight of systems that deny them their basic human rights. The wealthy and powerful continue to build their legacies on the backs of those with little or no voice. The parallels between the ancient world and today are striking. The priests of Ammon, who controlled the wealth of the temples, used divine authority to justify the exploitation of the powerless. Today, we see similar patterns in the way large corporations, political elites, and even religious institutions use their influence to perpetuate cycles of poverty and oppression. Just as the priests masked their actions with the guise of sacred duty, today's power structures often hide behind the language of tradition, progress, or even freedom, while they continue to benefit from the suffering of others. But the past has a way of catching up with us. The voices that were silenced for so long, like the handprints of the girls in the temple, will not stay buried forever. We are starting to see a shift. The walls that once concealed the truth are starting to crack, and the stories of those who were ignored are finally being told. The modern world is filled with those who, like the children of ancient Egypt, are still fighting for their voices to be heard. And just as those girls left their mark on the temple walls, today's generation has the power to make a difference. We have the opportunity to dismantle the systems that perpetuate harm, to listen to the voices of the oppressed, and to create a world where justice is not just a concept, but a reality. The question we face now is, will we listen? Will we learn from the past, not just to admire the beauty of ancient monuments, but to recognize the stories of pain and resistance that were written into them? Will we choose to act on the knowledge we have, to push for change, and to build a society that values compassion over power? The handprints beneath the Temple of Mut serve as a constant reminder that the most important stories are often the ones that are hidden from view. They remind us that the greatest victories are not always the ones that are celebrated, but the ones that happen when we choose to stand up for those who have no voice. These handprints are more than just remnants of an ancient time. They are a challenge to us. A challenge to ensure that the voices of the unheard are no longer silenced.